The tribunal please, the next subject will be the presentation of supplemental evidence concerning the persecution of the churches by Colonel Wheeler. Colonel Wheeler.
The material now to be submitted comprises, first, supplemental proof on the suppression of the churches within Germany, the Evangelical churches, the Catholic Church, and the Bibelforscher, or Bible researchers. And second, acts of suppression in the annexed and occupied territories, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. A large part of this proof will be from the official files of the Vatican. I now submit to the Court United States Trial Brief H, supplemental, on suppression of the Christian churches in Germany and in the occupied territories, and document book H, supplemental, containing English translations of all the documents referred to in the supplemental brief or to be referred to in my oral presentation. I shall take up first the supplemental proof on the suppression of the churches in Germany. Hitler announced in March 1933 a distinction in his policy toward politics and morals on the one hand, and religion on the other. I offer in evidence document number 3387 PS, United States Exhibit number 566. This is a speech by Hitler to the Reichstag on March 23, 1933, quoted in the Völkische Beobachter for March 24, 1933, page 1, column 5 of the German newspaper. I quote from this speech: "While the government is determined to carry through the political and moral purging of our public life, it is creating and ensuring prerequisites for a truly religious life. The government sees in both Christian confessions the factors most important for the maintenance of our folkdom. It will respect agreements concluded between them and the states. However, it expects that its work will meet with a similar appreciation. The government will treat all other denominations with equal objective justice. However, it can never condone that belonging to a certain denomination or to a certain race might be regarded as a license to commit or tolerate crimes. The government will devote its care to the sincere living together of church and state. Toward the evangelical churches, the Nazi conspirators proceeded at first with caution and an appearance of legality. They set up a new constitution of the German Evangelical Church, which introduced the innovation of a single Lutheran Reichsbishop, who assumed all the administrative functions of the old agencies of the churches. I refer to document number 3433 PS, the decree concerning the constitution of the German Evangelical Church, dated July 14, 1933, appearing in the Reichsgesetzblatt, 1933, Part 1, page 471, and request that the court take judicial notice of it. It is too well known to require documentation that the new Reichsbishop, Bishop Müller, heeded the voice of his Nazi masters. One of his first steps was to maneuver the Evangelical Youth Association into the Hitler Jugend under the defendant von Schirach in December 1933. In proof of this, I refer to document number 1458 PS, 1458A PS, already in evidence as part of document book D. This is an excerpt from von Schirach's book, The Hitler Youth, Idea and Formation. By 1935, it had become evident that more than persuasion by the Reichsbishop was necessary. Consequently, the Nazi conspirators promulgated a number of public laws which, under innocent-sounding titles, gradually wove a tight net of state control over all the affairs of the evangelical churches. I ask that the court take judicial notice of these laws published in the Reichsgesetzblatt. These may be briefly summarized as follows. 3434 PS, law concerning procedure for decisions in legal affairs of the Evangelical Church, dated 26 June 1935, signed by Hitler and Frick, appearing in 1935 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 774. This gave the Reich Ministry of the Interior, the defendant Frick, when question was raised in a civil lawsuit, sole authority to determine the validity of measures taken in the Evangelical State Church or in the German Evangelical Church since May 1, 1933. 3435 PS, first ordinance for execution of the law concerning procedure for decisions in legal affairs of the Evangelical Church, dated July 3, 1935, appearing in 1935 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 851. This implemented the earlier law by setting up an office for decisions with 3 members appointed by the Reich Minister of the Interior. 3466 PS, decree to unite the competences of Reich and Prussia in church affairs, dated July 16, 1935, signed by Hitler, published in 1935 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 1029. This transferred to Reich Minister without portfolio Kerl, Kerrl, the church affairs hitherto handled by the Reich and Prussian Ministers of the Interior, and for science, education, and training of the population. 3436 PS, law for the safeguarding of the German Evangelical Church, dated 24 September 1935, published in 1935 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 1178, signed by Hitler and the Minister for Church Affairs, Dr. Kerl. This empowered the Reich Minister of Church Affairs to issue ordinances with binding legal force. 3437 PS, Fifth Decree for execution of the law for the safeguarding of the German Evangelical Church, dated December 2, 1935, published in 1935 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 1370. This prohibited organs of church leadership in the evangelical churches from filling pastorates, engaging clerical assistants, examining and ordaining candidates of the state churches, visitation, publishing of the banns, and collection and administration of church dues and assessments. This series of laws culminated on June 26, 1937, in document number 3439 PS, the 15th decree for the execution of the law for security of the German Evangelical Church, dated June 25, 1937, published in 1937 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 1, page 697. By this, the Reich Minister for Church Affairs, Kerl, established a finance department for the churches to supervise the administration of all church property, the budget, and the use of budget funds, and to regulate salaries and allowances of officials, clergy, and employees. Thus, before the outbreak of war, the Nazi conspirators had the evangelical churches tied hand and foot, physically and administratively, if not spiritually. Against the Catholic Church, with its international organization, the Nazi conspirators launched a most vigorous and drastic attack, again at first, however, cloaked under a mantle of cooperation and legality. A concordat signed by the defendant von Papen, one of the foremost Catholic laymen in Germany, was concluded between the Reich government and the Vatican on July 20, 1933. It is printed in the 1933 Reichsgesetzblatt, Part 2, page 679, at page 680, and contained in document number 3280A PS, and I ask the court to take judicial notice of it. I quote Article 1. The German Reich guarantees freedom of profession and public practice of the Catholic religion. It acknowledges the right of the Catholic Church, within the limit of those laws which are applicable to all, to manage and regulate her own affairs independently and within the framework of her own competence to publish laws and ordinances binding on her members. Other articles, which being matters of common knowledge, I assume need not be read into the record, formulated basic principles such as freedom of the Catholic press, of Catholic education, and of Catholic charitable, professional, and other organizations. The proposal for the Concordat came from the Reich, not from the Vatican. I refer to document number 3268 PS, USA Exhibit number 356, excerpts from the allocution of Pope Pius XII to the Sacred College on June 2, 1945, already read into evidence. I quote from page 1 of the English mimeograph excerpts, page 1 of the German translation, third paragraph, which has not previously been read. In the spring 1933, the German government asked the Holy See to conclude a concordat with the Reich. The present Pope, Pope Pius XII, then Cardinal Pacelli, negotiated and signed the concordat on behalf of the Vatican. As Archbishop Pacelli, he had previously been papal nuncio in Germany for 12 years. Relying upon the Nazis' assurances, particularly Hitler's speech of March 23, 1933, above quoted, the Catholic hierarchy revoked its previous opposition against Catholics becoming members of the National Socialist Party. I offer in evidence document number 3389 PS, USA Exhibit 566. A pastoral letter dated March 23, 1933, from the Bishop of Cologne. And I quote from the Völkischer Beobachter for March 29, 1933, page 2, columns 2 and 3, the official announcement by the Archbishop of Cologne, Cardinal Schulte, in behalf of the Bishops' Conference at Fulda, 28 March 1933. The High Shepherds of the Dioceses of Germany, in their dutiful anxiety to keep the Catholic faith pure and to protect the untouchable aims and rights of the Catholic Church, have adopted, for profound reasons during the last years, an oppositional attitude toward the National Socialist movement through prohibitions and warnings, which was to be in effect as long and as far as those reasons remained valid. It now must be recognized that there are official and solemn declarations issued by the highest representative of the Reich government, who at the same time is the authoritarian leader of that movement, which acknowledge the inviolability of the teachings of Catholic faith and the unchangeable tasks and rights of the Church, and which expressly assure the full value of the legal pacts concluded between the various German states and the Church, without lifting the condemnation of certain religious and ethical errors implied in our previous measures. The Episcopate now believes it can entertain the confidence that those prescribed general prohibitions and warnings may not be regarded as necessary anymore. The Catholic Center Party, yielding to these assurances and to pressure, was dissolved on July 5, 1933. I refer to document number 2403 PS, already in evidence as part of United States Document Book B, an excerpt from Documents of German Politics, the official Nazi publication, a document of which the court can take judicial notice. And I quote from the last 5 lines of page 1 of the English translation, appearing on page 55 of the original German text, which states, quote, "Also the parties of German Catholicism, which was supposed to be most deeply rooted, had to bow to the law of the new order. On July 4, 1933, the Bavarian People's Party, document 27, and on July 5, 1933, the Center Party, document 29, published an announcement of their dissolution. In spite of these evidences of confidence and cooperation or submission on the part of the Catholics, the Nazi conspirators almost immediately commenced a series of violations of the Concordat. I offer in evidence document number 3476, United States Exhibit number 567, being the papal encyclical Mit brennender Sorge in German by Pope Pius XI on March 14, 1937, and also ask the tribunal to take judicial notice of all of it. I quote from the one-page English excerpts.
Did you say 3476 or 3466?
Yes, 3476, sir.
76. We don't seem to have that.
That may be a mistake, sir, for 3563. The number was changed. The part of it which is in English in the document book, sir, is under 3280 PS.
3280.
The difficulty is that we have the German original came in after the translation had been made from another source.
3280 A PS or 3280?
3280, sir. No, 3280 without the A. It's just a couple of paragraphs.
Oh, yes, I see.
These are found on page 2, paragraph 2 of the German original, which is in evidence now, which was secretly reproduced at Fulda from copies smuggled into Germany from Rome and read defiantly from pulpits all over Germany. I quote, "It discloses intrigues which from the beginning had no other aim than a war of extermination. In the furrows in which we had labored to sow the seeds of true peace, others, like the enemy in Holy Scripture, Matthew 13, verse 25, sowed the tares of suspicion, discord, hatred, calumny, of secret and open fundamental hostility to Christ and his church, fed from 1,000 different sources and making use of every available means. On them and on them alone, and on their silent and vocal protectors, rests the responsibility that now, on the horizon of Germany, there is to be seen not the rainbow of peace, but the threatening storm clouds of destructive religious wars. Anyone who has any sense of truth left in his mind, and even a shadow of the feeling of justice left in his heart, will have to admit that in the difficult and eventful years which followed the Concordat, every word and every action of ours was ruled by loyalty to the terms of the agreement. But also he will have to recognize, with surprise and deep disgust, that the unwritten law of the other party has been arbitrary misinterpretation of agreements, evasions of agreements, evacuation of the meaning of agreements, and finally, more or less open violation of agreements. Only 10 days after the Concordat was signed...
None of this is in our book.
No, sir. That's not in your book?
Well, not what you've been reading. The first paragraph down to the words destructive religious wars is in our book. The rest isn't in it.
I think there must have been an error today then, sir. There was a second edition of that 3280, which contains the second paragraph. Oh. And I'll have that substituted
all right.
As soon as this is over.
Rechtsanwalt Dr. Alfred Seidel, Verteidiger des Angeklagten Hans Frank.
Was shocked?
Hans Frank.
Oh. Yes.
Es wurde von dem Herrn Anklagevertreter der Vereinigten Staaten vorhin erklärt, dass ein Teil des Materials, das hier in der Frage des Kampfes gegen die Kirchen vorgelegt wird, vom Vatikan zur Verfügung gestellt wurde. Es hat mir nun der Angeklagte Hans Frank ein Schreiben zugeleitet, das eine Frage enthält, und ich möchte diese Frage dem Gericht nicht vorenthalten. Die Frage lautet: Ist der Vatikan dem Statut des Internationalen Militärgerichtshofs beigetreten? Fragezeichen. Hat er das Material? Oh, Moment. Ich wiederhole die Frage. Ich wiederhole die Frage, jawohl. Ist der Vatikan dem Statut des Internationalen Militärgerichtshofs beigetreten? Fragezeichen. Zweite Frage. Hat er das Material als Mitankläger geliefert? Fragezeichen. Die dritte Frage lautet: Hat er sich die Grundsätze dieses Verfahrens als Klagevertreter zu eigen gemacht? Der Angeklagte Hans Frank begründet diese Fragen damit, dass von ihrer Beantwortung sein weiteres Verbleiben in der katholischen Kirche abhängig ist.
I think it's desirable that the tribunal understand your objection. The first question that you ask is the Vatican a signatory to the Charter? Is that right?
Jawohl.
Your second question was what? What was your second question?
Ob der Vatikan das Material, das hier vorgelegt wird, als Mitankläger geliefert hat.
And your third?
Die dritte Frage war, und sie richtet sich ja an die Anklagebehörde zunächst, ob sich der Vatikan die Grundsätze dieses Verfahrens hier als Klagevertreter zu eigen gemacht hat.
Whether repeat the question, will you? Repeat the question.
Die letzte Frage.
Yes.
Ja, die letzte Frage lautet: hat sich der Vatikan mit der Vorlage dieses Materials die Grundsätze dieses Verfahrens hier vor dem Internationalen Militärgerichtshof als Klagevertreter zu eigen gemacht. Und als Grund für seine Fragen gibt der Angeklagte Hans Frank an, dass von ihrer Beantwortung sein weiteres Verbleiben in der katholischen Kirche abhängig sein wird.
Tribunal, the observations which have just been made by counsel on behalf of the defendant Frank are entirely irrelevant, and any motion which they were intended to support is denied. And the
I now offer in evidence the first of a number of documents which the Vatican has supplied to the prosecution in this case from its own files, and which authoritatively state the acts of suppression of the Church by the Nazi conspirators. This first Vatican document, which deals in part with acts of suppression within Germany, is document number 3261 PS, USA Exhibit number 568, a verbal note of the Secretariat of State of His Holiness the Pope to the German Embassy, dated January 18, 1942. I read the certificate accompanying this document. The Vatican, November 13, 1945. I, Domenico Tardini, Secretary of Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, hereby certify that the attached document, consisting of 9 printed pages and entitled Verbal Note of the Secretariat of State of His Holiness to the German Embassy, January 18, 1942, pages 3 to 11, is a true and correct translation into the English language from the Italian language of a carbon copy of a document now in the possession of the Secretariat of State of His Holiness, the original of which was dispatched to the German Embassy, signed Domenico Tardini. The paper in the document book, Your Honors, is a mimeographed copy of the same printed document which we received from the Vatican. We did not have enough printed documents to make them in the document books. On page 2 of the English mimeographed text of this verbal note, paragraphs 3 and 4, appearing on page 2 of the German translation, paragraphs 3 and 4, the Papal Secretary of State describes, I quote, measures and acts which gravely violate the rights of the Church, being contrary not only to the existing concordats, but to the principles of international law ratified by the Second Hague Conference.
Did you say you were reading the third paragraph?
The paragraphs 3 and 4, yes, sir.
Which, on page 2?
Yes, Your Honor, it's the third full paragraph on page 2. It starts in the middle of the paragraph,
well,
the last word on the 7th line of the third paragraph.
It's very difficult for us to find it if you don't tell us that it begins in the middle of the paragraph.
I'm sorry, sir.
What words does it begin with?
The last line of that line is measures. The last word is measures. It's the 7th line of the paragraph beginning, yet, despite this keen desire.
Yes, I see.
You see it now, sir?
Yes.
But often, and this is much more grave, to the very fundamental principles of divine law, both natural and positive. The next paragraph specifies these measures. I quote, let it suffice to recall in this connection, among other things, the changing of the Catholic state elementary schools into undenominational schools, the permanent or temporary closing of many minor seminaries, of not a few major seminaries, and of some theological faculties, the suppression of almost all the private schools and of numerous Catholic boarding schools and colleges, the repudiation, decided unilaterally, of financial obligations which the state, municipalities, and so forth had towards the church, the increasing difficulties put in the way of the activity of the religious orders and congregations in the spiritual, cultural, and social field, and above all, the suppression of abbeys, monasteries, convents, and religious houses in such great numbers that one is led to infer a deliberate intention of rendering impossible the very existence of the orders and congregations in Germany. The Nazis did not overlook other sects or denominations in their efforts to suppress Christian religion in Germany. They persecuted the Bibelforscher, or Bible research workers, as well.
Perhaps if you're going to another church, it would be better to break off till tomorrow morning.
The Nazis did not overlook other sects or denominations in their efforts to suppress Christian religion in Germany. They persecuted the Bibelforscher, or Bible research workers, as well. There has already been introduced and read into evidence document number D84, USA Exhibit number 236, showing that members of this sect were not only prosecuted in the courts, but also seized and sent to concentration camps even after serving or remitting of their judicial sentences. In document number 2928 PS, USA Exhibit 239, included in USA Document Book A, further evidence of persecution of Bibelforschers appears.
I think you're going a little bit fast. We're not going to refer to D84?
I'm not going to read from it, sir. It's
No,
been
all
already
right.
read into evidence.
Then you go to 2928 PS.
2928 PS is in the document book, sir.
Are you going to read from there?
I was going to read a few lines from that, just.
Very well.
This document is an affidavit by Matthias Lex, Vice President of the National Union of Shoemakers. In describing his experience in Dachau concentration camp, he says, and I quote from the third page of his affidavit, paragraph 9, 11 lines from the bottom.
Yes.
I include in the political prisoners the Bible researchers.
Wait a minute, that's not paragraph 9 at the beginning.
It's near the end of the page, sir.
Paragraph 9, you said, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Of 2928 PS.
Paragraph 9 is a long paragraph, and there is a list of names of individuals at the camp, and it's on the second page of that list, at the bottom of the, about 10 lines up from the bottom of that page.
When I was released, the Bible fortress.
There's a long paragraph, starts after number 33, the name of one of the men in the camp.
Yes.
And I'm just reading that one sentence. I include in the political prisoners the Bible researchers, Bibelforscher, whose number I estimate at over 150. Now, I want to read further from the last line of that page and the next few lines of the next page. The following groups were kept entirely isolated. The members of the so-called punishment companies, Strafkompanien, who were in a concentration camp for a second time, and after about 1937, also the Bibelforscher. Members of the punishment companies were such prisoners who had committed disciplinary or slight offenses against the camp regulations. The following groups lived separately but could mix with the other groups during the day, either while working or while strolling through the camp. Political prisoners, Jews, anti-socials, gypsies, felons, homosexuals, and before 1937, also the Bible researchers. I refer also to document number 1531 PS. This is not in the document book. USA Exhibit number 248, which is already in evidence. This was an order by the RSHA in 1942 authorizing third-degree methods against Jehovah's Witnesses. That was read by Colonel Story. I now turn to acts of suppression in the annexed and occupied territories. In Austria, Bishop Paulus Rusch of Innsbruck has written an illuminating report on this subject. I offer this sworn statement in evidence, 3278 PS, USA Exhibit number 569. This is a report on the fighting of National Socialism in the Apostolic administration of Innsbruck, Feldkirch, of Tyrol, and Vorarlberg. In this, the bishop declares, and I start on the first page of the English text and of the German translation. After having seized power, National Socialism immediately showed the tendency to exclude church from publicity.
First page. Why don't go too fast?
That's 3278. Yes.
Yes.
The expression publicity, this was written in English by the bishop, evidently means public activities. I continue with a quote. At Corpus Christi in 1938, the customary solemn procession was forbidden. In the summer of the same year, all ecclesiastical schools and kindergartens were disbanded. Daily newspapers and weekly reviews of Christian thinking were likewise removed. In the same year, all kinds of ecclesiastical organizations, especially youth organizations such as Boy Scouts, were disbanded, all activity forbidden. The effect of these prohibitions came soon. The clergy took opposition against them. They could not do otherwise. Then a great wave of priest arrests followed. About a fifth of them were eventually arrested. Reasons for arrests were, 1, the pulpit paragraph. When party actions were mentioned or criticized, even in the humblest manner. 2, the practice of the care of young people. A specially heavy prohibition was given in November 1939. Children's or youth's mass or services were forbidden. Religion or faith lessons were not allowed to be given in the church except lessons of preparing for First Communion or confirmation. Teaching of religion at school was very often forbidden without any reason. The priest, according to his conscience, could not follow this public proscription, and this explained the great number of arrests of priests. Finally, priests were arrested on account of their caritative work. It was, for instance, forbidden to give anything to foreigners or prisoners. A priest was arrested because he gave a cup of coffee and bread to 2 hungry Dutchmen. This caritative act was seen to favor elements foreign to the race. In 1939 and 1940, a new activity began. Cloisters and abbeys were seized, disbanded, and many churches belonging to them closed. Among these, 2 nun-convents were disbanded, the cloister of the Dominican Sisters of Bludenz and that of the Perpetual Adoration of Innsbruck. In the latter, the sisters were dragged one by one out of the cloister by the Gestapo. In the same way, ecclesiastical property such as association houses, parish, and youth homes were seized. A list of these closed churches, disbanded cloisters, and ecclesiastical institutions is attached. Despite all these measures, the results were not satisfactory. Then priests not only were arrested, but also deported to concentration camps. 8 priests of Tyrol and Vorarlberg have been imprisoned, among them the Provicar Monsignore Dr. Charles Lampert. 1 died there on account of the ill treatment. The others returned. Provicar Lampert was released, but required to remain in Stettin, where later he was rearrested and executed in November 1944, after having been condemned to death by secret proceedings. There is attached to this report a 3.5-page list entitled List of Churches, Convents, Monasteries, and Ecclesiastical Objects of Tyrol and Vorarlberg, seized, respectively, confiscated, further of the institutions, confessional schools, and so forth, disbanded. Unless the tribunal requires it, I shall not read these names. I offer in evidence 3274 PS, USA Exhibit number 570, received from Cardinal Initzer of Vienna and authenticated by him. This is the first joint pastoral letter of the archbishops and bishops of Austria after liberation, dated October 17, 1945. I quote from page 1, second paragraph of the English and German texts, which sums up the Nazi conspirators' campaign in Austria. A war which has raged terribly and horribly, like none other in past epochs of the history of humanity, is at an end. At an end also is an intellectual battle, the goal of which was the destruction of Christianity and church among our people. A campaign of lies and treachery against truth and love, against divine and human rights, and against international law. I quote further from the 4th and following paragraphs. Direct hostility to the church was revealed in regulations against orders and monasteries, Catholic schools and institutions, against religious foundations and activities, against the buildings of ecclesiastical houses and institutions. Without the least right to defend themselves, they were declared enemies of both people and state, and their existence destroyed. Religious instruction and education of children and youth were purposely limited, frequently entirely prevented. They encouraged in every manner all efforts hostile to religion and the church, and thus sought to rob the children and youth of our people of the most valuable treasure of holy faith and of true morality born of the Spirit of God. Unfortunately, the attempt succeeded in innumerable cases to the permanent damage of young people. Spiritual care of souls in churches and ecclesiastical houses, in hospitals and other institutions was seriously obstructed. It was made ineffectual in the armed forces and in the labor service, in the sending of youth to the country, and beyond that, even in individual families and among numerous persons, to say nothing of the prohibition of spiritual ministration to people of another nationality and of other races. How often was the divine service as such, also sermons, folk missions, communion days, retreats, processions, pilgrimages, limited for the most impossible reasons and made entirely impossible. Catholic literature, newspapers, periodicals, church papers, religious writings were stopped, books and libraries destroyed. What an injustice occurred in the dissolution of many Catholic societies, in the destruction of numerous church activities. Individual Catholic and Christian believers whose religious confession was allegedly free were spied upon, criticized on account of their belief, scorned on account of their Christian activity. How many loyal officials, teachers, public and private employees, laborers, businessmen, and artisans, indeed even peasants, were put under pressure and terror. Many lost their jobs, some were pensioned off, others dismissed without pension, demoted, deprived of their real professional activity. Often enough, such people who remained loyal to their convictions were discriminated against, condemned to hunger, or tortured in concentration camps. Christianity and the Church were continually scorned and exposed to hatred. The apostasy movement found every assistance. Every opportunity was used to induce many to withdraw from the Church. In assessing responsibility for these acts of suppression in Austria, the court will recall that the defendant von Schirach was Gauleiter of Vienna from 1940 to 1945. I now come to the acts of suppression in Czechoslovakia, where, the court will recollect, the defendant von Neurath was Reichsprotector for Bohemia and Moravia from 1939 to 1943, and was succeeded by the defendant Frick. These acts have been summarized in an official Czech government report. I offer in evidence 998 PS, USA Exhibit number 91, already in evidence. This is excerpts not previously read or referred to from the Czech official report for the persecution and trial of the German major war criminals by the International Military Tribunal, established according to the agreement of the four great powers of August 8, 1945. Since this is an official government document or report of one of the United Nations, I ask that the tribunal take judicial notice of it under Article 21 of the Charter, and I suggest that I be permitted to summarize rather than read it. It describes the maltreatment of Catholic priests, 487 of whom were sent to concentration camps as hostages, dissolution of religious orders, suppression of religious instruction in Czech schools, suppression of Catholic weeklies and monthlies, dissolution of the Catholic Gymnastic Organization of 800,000 members, and seizure of Catholic church property. It describes the entire prohibition of the Czechoslovak National Church and confiscation of all its property in Slovakia and its crippling in Bohemia. The report describes the severe restriction on freedom of preaching by the Protestants, and the persecution and imprisonment and execution of ministers and suppression of Protestant church youth organizations and theological schools, and shows the complete subordination and later dissolution of the Greek Orthodox Church. It states that all evangelical education was handed over to the civil authorities, and many evangelical teachers lost their employment. The repressive measures adopted by the Nazi conspirators in Poland against the Christian church were even more drastic and sweeping. The Vatican Documents now to be introduced describe persecutions of the Catholic Church in Poland in three areas. First, the incorporated territories, especially the Warthegau. Second, the Gouvernement General. And third, the incorporated Eastern Territories. The court will recall that the incorporated territories comprised territories adjacent to the Old Reich, chiefly the Reich District Vaterland, or Warthegau, which included particularly the cities of Poznan and Lodz, and the Reich District Danzig, West Prussia. The occupied Polish territories, which were organized into the Gouvernement General, comprised the remainder of Poland, seized by the German forces in 1939, and extending to the new boundary with the Soviets formed at that time. This included Warsaw and Krakow. After the Nazis attacked the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in June 1941, the parts of Old Poland lying further to the east and then overrun were included in the so-called occupied Eastern Territories. For the purpose of tying in the defendants' responsibility for the persecutions occurring in their respective areas, the court will bear in mind that the defendant Frick was the official chiefly responsible for the reorganization of the Eastern Territories. The defendant Frank was head of the Gouvernement General from 1939 to 1945. The defendant Seyss-Inquart was Deputy Governor General there from 1939 to 1940, and the defendant Rosenberg was Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories from July 17, 1941 to the end. I now offer in evidence document number 3263 PS, USA Exhibit number 571, headed, I quote, Memorandum of the Secretariat of State to the German Embassy regarding the religious situation in the Warthegau, October 8, 1942. This document bears a certificate of authenticity from the Vatican, signed by the Papal Secretary of Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, corresponding to that accompanying 3261 PS, read in evidence a few minutes ago. Unless the court requires otherwise, I suggest it is not necessary to read each of these certificates, which are all similar to each other. I quote from 3263 PS, the first paragraph. For quite a long time, the religious situation in the region called the Warthegau gives cause for very grave and ever-increasing anxiety. There, in fact, the episcopate has been little by little almost completely eliminated. The secular and regular clergy have been reduced to proportions that are absolutely inadequate because they have been in large part deported and exiled. The education of clerics has been forbidden, the Catholic education of youth is meeting with the greatest opposition. The nuns have been dispersed. Insurmountable obstacles have been put in the way of affording people the helps of religion. Very many churches have been closed. Catholic, intellectual, and charitable institutions have been destroyed. Ecclesiastical property has been seized. On March 2, 1943, the Cardinal Secretary of State addressed to the defendant von Ribbentrop, Foreign Minister of the Reich, a note setting forth in detail the persecutions of bishops, priests, and other ecclesiastics, and suppression of the exercise of religion in the occupied Polish provinces. This document is so explicit and so authoritative that it deserves extensive quotation. I accordingly offer it in evidence, document number 3264 PS, USA Exhibit number 572. It is headed, "A Note of His Eminence, the Cardinal Secretary of State, to the Foreign Minister of the Reich about the religious situation in the Warthegau and in the other Polish provinces subject to Germany." It bears a Vatican certificate of authenticity like that of 3261 PS. It is signed L. Card Maglione, meaning Luigi Cardinal Maglione. I quote from this note, starting with page 1, the third paragraph of the English mimeograph text and of the German translation. The place where, above all, the religious situation, by its unusual gravity, calls for special consideration is the territory called the Reichsgau Vaterland. 6 bishops resided in that region in August 1939. Now there is left only one. In fact, the Bishop of Lodz, Litzmannstadt, and his auxiliary were, in the course of the year 1941, confined first in a small district of the diocese, and then expelled and exiled in the General Gouvernement. Another bishop, Monsignor Michael Kozal, auxiliary and vicar general of Władysławia, was arrested in the autumn of 1939, detained for some time in a prison in the city, and later in a religious house in Lad, and finally was transferred to the concentration camp at Dachau. Since His Eminence the Cardinal Archbishop of Gniezno and Poznan and the Bishop of Władysławia, who had gone away during the period of military operations, were not allowed to return to their sees, the only bishop who now remains in the Warthegau is His Excellency Monsignor Valentin Dimek, auxiliary of Poznan, and he, at least up to November 1942, was interned in his own house. I pass now to page 2, fourth paragraph of the English text, the fifth paragraph of the German text. If the lot of their excellencies, the bishops, has been a source of anxiety for the Holy See, the condition of an immense number of priests and religious has caused it, and still causes it, no less grief. In the territory now called Warthegau, more than 2,000 priests exercised their ministry before the war. They are now reduced to a very small number. According to accounts received from various quarters by the Holy See, in the first months of the military occupation, not a few members of the secular clergy were shot or otherwise put to death, while others, some hundreds, were imprisoned or treated in an unseemly manner, being forced into employments unbecoming their state and exposed to scorn and derision. Then, while numbers of ecclesiastics were exiled or constrained in some other way to take refuge in the general government, many others were transferred to concentration camps. At the beginning of October 1941, the priests from the dioceses of the Vatican detained in Dachau already numbered several hundreds, but their number increased considerably in that month following a sharp intensification of police measures which culminated in the imprisonment and deportation of further hundreds of ecclesiastics. Entire Kreise districts remained thus completely deprived of clergy. In the city of Poznan itself, the spiritual care of some 200,000 Catholics remained in the hands of not more than 4 priests. No less painful was the fate reserved for the regular clergy. Many religious were shot or otherwise killed. The great majority of the others were imprisoned, deported, or expelled. In the same way, far-reaching measures were taken against the institutions preparing candidates for the ecclesiastical state. The diocesan seminaries of Gniezno and Poznan, of Vladistavia, and of Lodz were closed. The seminary in Poznan for the training of priests destined to work among Polish Catholics abroad was also closed. The novitiates and houses of formation of the religious orders and congregations were closed. Not even the nuns were able to continue their charitable activities without molestation. For them were set up a special concentration camp at Bojanowo, where towards the middle of 1941, about 400 sisters were interned and employed in manual labor. To a representation of the Holy See made through the Apostolic Nunciature in Berlin, your Reich Ministry for Foreign Affairs replied in the memorandum giving the number of September 28 of the same year that it was only question of a temporary measure taken with the consent of the Reichslieutenant for Vaterland in order to supply the lack of housing for Polish Catholic sisters. In the same memorandum, it was admitted that as a result of reorganization of charitable institutions, many Catholic sisters were without employment. But in spite of the fact that this measure was declared to be temporary, it is certain that towards the end of 1942, some hundreds of nuns were still interned at Bojanowo. It is established that for some time the religious were deprived even of spiritual help. Likewise, in the matter of education and religious instruction of youth, no attention was paid in the Vaterland, Vatican, to the rights of the Catholic Church. All the Catholic schools were suppressed. I turn now to page 4.
Who was the minister, the foreign minister of the Reich at the time that document was sent to?
That was the defendant von Ribbentrop.
Ribbentrop.
I turn to page 4, the 10th paragraph of the English text. Page 5, 4th paragraph of the German text. The use of the Polish language in sacred functions and even in the sacrament of penance was forbidden. You find that, sir?
Which page you are?
That's page 4, just below the middle of the page. Paragraph beginning, the use of the Polish language
Yes.
in sacred functions. And even in the sacrament of penance was forbidden. Moreover, and this is a matter worthy of special mention, and is at variance with the natural law and with the dispositions accepted by the legal systems of all nations, for the celebration of marriage between Poles, the minimum age limit was fixed at 28 years for men and 25 years for women. Catholic action was so badly hit as to be completely destroyed. The National Institute, which was at the head of the whole Catholic action movement in Poland, was suppressed. As a result, all the associations belonging to it, which were flourishing, as well as all Catholic cultural, charity, and social service institutions, were abolished. In the whole of the Warthegau, there is no longer any Catholic press and not even a Catholic bookshop. Grave measures were repeatedly taken with regard to ecclesiastical property. Many of the churches closed to public worship were turned over to profane uses. From such an insult, not even the cathedrals of Gniezno, Poznan, Władysławia, and Lodz were spared. Episcopal residences were confiscated. The real estate belonging to the seminaries, convents, diocesan museums, libraries, and church funds were confiscated or sequestered. I pass now to the third full paragraph on page 5, a two-line paragraph. Even before ecclesiastical property was affected, the allowances to the clergy had been abolished. Now reading from page 6, the fourth full paragraph of the English text. The administrative regulations published by the Lieutenant's Office for the application of the Ordinance of September 13, 1941, made the situation of the Catholics in that region still more difficult. For example, on November 19, 1941, came a decree of the Reichslieutenant by which, among other things, it was set forth that as from the previous September 13th, the property of the former juridical persons of the Roman Catholic Church should pass over to the Römisch-Katholischen Kirche Deutscher Nationalität in Reichsgau-Vaterland, insofar as, on the request of the above-mentioned Religionsgesellschaft, such property shall be recognized by the Reichslieutenant as non-Polish property. In virtue of this decree, practically all the goods of the Catholic Church in the Warthegau were lost. Now I pass to page 7, the second full paragraph. If we pass from the Warthegau to the other territories in the east, we unfortunately find there, too, acts and measures against the rights of the Church and of the Catholic faithful, though they vary in gravity and extension from one place to another. In the provinces which were declared annexed to the German Reich and joined up with the Gaue of East Prussia, of Danzig, West Prussia, and of Upper Silesia, the situation is very like that described above in regard to seminaries, the use of the Polish mother tongue in sacred functions, charitable works, associations of Catholic action, the separation of the faithful according to nationality. There, too, one must deplore the closing of churches to public worship, the exile, deportation, the violent death of not a few of the clergy, reduced by 2/3 in the Diocese of Kulma and by at least 1/3 in the Diocese of Katowice, the suppression of religious instruction in the schools, and above all, the complete suppression, in fact, of the episcopate. Actually, after the Bishop of Kulma, who had left during the military operations, had been refused permission to return to his diocese, there followed in February 1941 the expulsion of the Bishop of Plock and his auxiliary, who both died later in captivity. The bishop, the venerable octogenarian, Monsignor Julian Anthony Nowowiecki, died at Gialdowo on May 28, 1941, and the auxiliary, Monsignor Leo Wetmansky, in a transit camp in October 10th of the same year. In the territory called the General Government, as in the Polish provinces which had been occupied by Soviet troops in the period between September 1939 and June 1941, the religious situation is such as to cause the Holy See lively apprehension and serious preoccupation. Without pausing to describe the treatment meted out in many cases to the clergy, priests imprisoned, deported, and even put to death, the confiscation of ecclesiastical property, the closing of churches, the suppression even of associations and publications of simply and exclusively religious character, the closing of the Catholic secondary and higher schools, and of the Catholic University of Lublin, let it suffice to recall two series of specially grave measures, those which affect the seminaries and those which weigh on the episcopate. When the buildings of the various seminaries had been completely or in part occupied, the intention for some time, November 1940 to February 1941, was to reduce these institutions for the training of priests to two, those of Krakow and Sandomir. Then the others were permitted to reopen, but only on condition that no new students were admitted, which in practice inevitably means that all these institutions will soon be closed. I skip one paragraph here. Mention has several times been made of ecclesiastics deported or confined in concentration camps. The majority of them were transferred to the Altreich, where their number already exceeds 1,000.
What was the Altreich?
Altreich is the old boundaries of Germany.
Yes.
When the Holy See asked that they should be liberated and be permitted to emigrate to neutral countries of Europe or America, 1940, the petition was refused. It was only promised that they should all be collected in the concentration camp at Dachau, that they should be dispensed from too hard labor, and that some should be permitted to say Mass, which the others could hear. The treatment of the ecclesiastics interned at Dachau, which for a certain time in 1941 was in fact somewhat mitigated, worsened again at the end of that year. Particularly sorrowful were the announcements which for many months in 1942 came from that camp of the frequent deaths of priests, even of some young priests among them. I pass by two paragraphs. Polish Catholics are not allowed to contract marriage in the territory of the Altreich. Just as requests for religious instruction or instruction in preparation for confession and Holy Communion for the children of these workers are in principle not accepted. What happened to complaints, even from the Vatican, as to religious affairs in the overrun territories is disclosed in document number 3266 PS, USA Exhibit number 573, which I now offer in evidence. This is a letter from the Cardinal Archbishop of Breslau to the Papal Secretary of State, dated December 7, 1942. It bears a Vatican authentication similar to those already read. This letter lays at the door of the party chancery the responsibility for determining the policy and exercising final authority on religious questions in the occupied territories. I quote from page 1, the first paragraph of this letter, and remind the court that the defendant Bormann was at that time the chief of the Nazi Party chancery, and that the defendant Kaltenbrunner was the chief of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, RSHA. I quote from 3266 PS, beginning with the sixth line. About some of the gravest injuries inflicted on the Church, I not only protested on each occasion as the individual incident occurred, but I also made a most formal protest about them in globo in a document which, as spokesman of all the hierarchy, I sent to the supreme ruler of the state and to the ministries of the Reich on December 10, 1941. Not a word by way of answer has been sent to us. Your Eminence knows very well the greatest difficulty in the way of opening negotiations comes from the overruling authority which the National Socialist Party Chancery exercises in relation to the Chancery of the Reich and to the single Reich ministries. This Parteikanzlei directs the course to be followed by the state, whereas the ministries and the Chancery of the Reich are obliged and compelled to adjust their decrees to these directions. Besides, there is the fact that the Supreme Office for the Security of the Reich, called the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, enjoys an authority which precludes all legal action and all appeals. Under it are the secret offices for public security, called Geheime Staatspolizei, a title shortened usually to Gestapo, of which there is one for each province. Against the decrees of this control office and of the secret offices, there is no appeal through the courts, and no complaint made to the ministries has any effect. Not infrequently, the councillors of the ministries suggest that they have not been able to do as they would wish to do because of the opposition of these party offices. As far as the executive power is concerned, the organization called the SS, that is, Schutzstaffeln der Partei, is in practice supreme. On a number of very grave and fundamental issues, we have also presented our complaints to the supreme leader of the Reich, the Führer. Either no answer is given, or it is apparently edited by the above-mentioned party chancery, which does not consider itself bound by the concordat made with the Holy See. I now offer in evidence document number 3279 PS, USA Exhibit number 574. This is an excerpt from charge number 17 against the defendant Hans Frank, Governor General of Poland, entitled Maltreatment and Persecution of the Catholic Clergy in the Western Provinces, submitted by the Polish government under the terms of Article 21 of the Four-Power Agreement of August 8, 1941. This gives further figures indicating the extent of the persecution of priests. I quote, "The extract attached hereto and dealing with the general conditions and results of the persecution is taken from the text of Charge 17, page 5, paragraph 4 of the Polish government against the defendants named in the indictment before the International Military Tribunal. Subject, maltreatment and persecution of the Catholic clergy in the incorporated Western Provinces of Poland." It is a true translation into English of the original Polish. It is submitted herewith to the International Military Tribunal in accordance with Article 21 of the Charter of the Court. Signed, Dr. Tadeusz Cyprian, Polish Deputy Representative on the United Nations War Crimes Commission in London, signing on behalf of the Polish government and of the Main Commission for Investigation of German War Crimes in Poland, whose seal I hereby attach.
I don't think you need read such certificates as that.
This is the only one, sir, that I have. I now read from this extract general conditions and results of the persecution. 11. The general situation of the clergy in the Archdiocese of Poznan in the beginning of April 1940 is summarized in the following words of Cardinal Juan's second report. 5 priests shot, 27 priests confined in harsh concentration camps at Stutthof and in other camps, 190 priests in prison or in concentration camps at Bruchsal, Śródowal, Goruski, Kazimierz, Biskupi, Lad, Lublin, and Pussy Sikowo. 35 priests seriously ill in consequence of ill treatment, 122 parishes entirely left without priests. 12. In the Diocese of Chelmo, where about 650 priests were installed before the war, only 3% were allowed to stay. The 97% of them were imprisoned, executed, or put into concentration camps. 13. By January 1941, about 700 priests were killed, 3,000 were in prison or concentration camps. I refer also to document number 3268A PS, USA Exhibit number 356, excerpts from the allocution of Pope Pius XII to the Sacred College, June 2, 1945, which has already been introduced into evidence and read from extensively. I shall not read from that again. This gives some very revealing figures concerning the priests and lay brothers confined in the concentration camp at Dachau. The tribunal will recall from the previous reading of this document the imprisonment of 2,800 ecclesiastical and religious in Dachau alone from 1940 to 1945, of whom all but about 800 were dead by April 1945, including an auxiliary bishop. This document presents a forceful summary of the principal steps in the struggle of the Nazi conspirators against the Catholic Church. In summation, the prosecution submits that the evidence presented to the court proves that the attempted suppression of the Christian churches in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland was an integral part of the defendant's conspiracy to eliminate internal opposition and otherwise to prepare for and wage aggressive war, and shows the same conspiratorial pattern as their other war crimes and crimes against humanity.